Today, we're in the Adirondacks and headed up to the top of the Empire State. Hi, I'm Skye Marthaler. Welcome to Rooftops of America. Today, we are in the beautiful Adirondacks of New York. But before we start this adventure, take a moment to click that red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to it for all the latest Rooftops of America updates. Located in upstate New York near Lake Placid, Mount Marcy is found in the High Peaks Wilderness in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains. The range is a large massif, covering about 5,000 square miles. If you want to find elevation in New York, this is the place to go. The Adirondacks has 46 peaks with an elevation over 4,000 feet, and it's the only range in the state with peaks with an elevation over 5,000 feet. The geology of the Adirondacks is absolutely fascinating, but to keep it simple, you can basically divide it up into two main parts. The first is how the peaks were actually created. And the second is how they were then shaped. The rocks you find in these mountains, they're ancient, formed over 1 billion years ago. And they actually were formed around the equator and slowly drifted north through continental drift. This isn't the first group of mountains here. The original range was formed by the Grenville orogeny dating back about 1 billion years ago. As time marched on, it slowly eroded away, and as the tectonic plates shifted, eventually, this area was covered by the Iapetus Ocean. Fast forward millions and millions of years. Over this period of tectonic activity, the continents broke up and then they reformed. But 3 key things happened that affected this area. The first was the creation of the faults that actually run underneath these mountains. The second was the changing of the rocks from sedimentary to metamorphic. And then finally, the third was the creation of a hot spot under the Canadian Shield. Unlike many of its Appalachian neighbors, the Adirondacks are a relatively new addition to the neighborhood. That hot spot created a dome that started to rise around 20 million years ago. The uplift continues to this day, with the Adirondacks rising at the speed of a foot every 100 years. Even with the uplift, don't expect the Adirondacks to reach the heights of the Rocky Mountains anytime soon. The second part of the story is in the shaping of these peaks through erosion. Around 1.6 million years ago, during the Pleistocene, this area was subjected to repeated glaciation, what is commonly called the Ice Age. When we think of the Ice Age, we normally think of it as just one thing, but the reality was a bit different. Over the period of 2 million years, there were multiple advancements and retreats of glaciers, massive sheets of ice coming down from the north, bulldozing and shaping the land, and then receding back. The most recent of these, and the one that most people think about, was the Wisconsin glaciation. The Wisconsin glaciation began 80,000 years ago and reached its greatest extent in New York around 21,000 years ago. The ice sheets carved the land, the massive power of these entities rounding off the peaks and moving tons of rock and debris. It's easy to think of the glaciers as just these massive walls of ice, but you also need to consider the water element of them. When they melt during deglaciation, all that water has to go somewhere, and it carves and cuts through the land just as much as the ice did. You can still see the effects of the glaciers in the Adirondacks all around you in the form of eskers, commies, and the kettle lakes and ponds scattered about. For hikers heading up Mount Marcy, one of the easiest clues to spot is the glacial erratics along the route. These massive stones, picked up by the glacier and deposited, sometimes hundreds of miles away from their point of origin. All this geological activity means the Adirondacks are rich in natural treasures and worth exploring if you have the time. Humans began trekking through and settling here not long after the glaciers receded. There's archaeological evidence of human habitation on the shores of Lake Champlain dating back over 15,000 years ago. Archaic tribes in the Laurentian culture started to move into this area around 8000 BCE. Primarily, they were hunters and gatherers, but they were also well connected, being part of the larger Great Lakes trading network, trading even for copper as far away as Lake Superior. As time ticked by, more cultures rose, along with the introduction of pottery and rudimentary agriculture. It's worth noting the tribes living in these mountains didn't just reside in a single area like a modern community. They moved on a seasonal rotation to familiar spots to not deplete local resources in any given place. They considered their entire rotation their home. For a long time, it was believed that the Adirondack Mountains were too rugged and too cold for settlement by native tribes, that if they were used, it was primarily as a hunting ground, if anything. That was a myth, though, happily perpetuated by white settlers, allowing them to claim these mountains without recourse. Modern archaeology has produced plenty of evidence to refute these claims and disabuse this myth. Fire pits, drills, spear points, and other artifacts show Native Americans living and thriving in the mountains for thousands of years, some dating back to 9000 BCE. Multiple sites have been identified in the Adirondacks, revealing this ignored and forgotten history. By the time the Europeans arrived, the two dominant cultures in this area were the Iroquois and the Algonquin. Neither side got on with the other, and the arrival of the Europeans exacerbated long simmering tribal conflicts. They also brought with them disease and cultural upheaval. Native American history in the Adirondacks is rich and complex, and if you want to learn more about it, then it's worth checking out both the Six Nations Indian Museum and the Adirondack Interpretive Center. While the coast of New York had been mapped as early as the 16th century, it was not until 1609 that Europeans ventured into the New York interior. It was English navigator Henry Hudson, sailing under the Dutch flag, who first sailed up the river now named for him. In an interesting twist, Hudson wasn't even supposed to be here. Hudson was originally hired by the Dutch to find a northeast passage to Asia. He was to do this by sailing along the coast of Russia. When he got to the site, though, the route he was supposed to take was actually iced over. So, chasing a rumor he had heard of a northwest passage, Henry Hudson opted to ignore his orders, and he set sail for North America. Hudson spent several weeks exploring the river and trading with native tribes, eventually reaching the spot of the current-day city of Troy. Despite going against instructions and failing to realize his overall objective, Henry Hudson gave the Dutch the incentive in the form of the fur trade and the justification to claim and colonize these lands. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company established the colony of the New Netherlands. They mainly focused their efforts between the Hudson and Delaware rivers, with the city of New Amsterdam serving as their chief trading hub. Dutch colonial interests were not centered around population growth, but instead were more economically driven. They were here to make money, and their colonial footprint reflected this. Centered around the river system, they focused in particular on the fur trade, referred to as soft gold, and the most prized of these furs were the beaver pelts. In the 17th century, the fur trade was big business, and beaver pelts, well, they were the creme de la creme. On average, a beaver pelt would fetch you about 7 guilders. That's about $420 in today's money. In 1626, the Dutch shipped back their first load of furs, only a few thousand being beaver. But at their height, they were sending back 80,000 beaver pelts a year. That came to about $33 million. And while that doesn't seem like a lot of money in our modern world, you have to remember that this was the first link in a very long economic chain, fueling the demand for cutting-edge style. The Dutch system relied on the native tribes to bring in the furs into Dutch-controlled trading posts. Once there, in exchange, the Dutch would provide the tribes with manufactured goods like firearms, metal tools like axes and knives, glassware, and iron pots. The fur trade, especially the demand for beaver pelts, had major consequences for native tribes, upsetting traditional roles, altering the balance of power, and fueling intertribal warfare. These series of conflicts became known as the Beaver Wars, and by their end in the beginning of the 18th century, the Iroquois Confederacy was the lone dominant power here in the Adirondacks and to the west. All other rivals had been driven away, assimilated, or destroyed. The soft gold trade also drew envious eyes from neighboring English colonies who wanted in on the action. The New Netherlands was hemmed in, bordered to the south by Virginia and Maryland, and to the northeast by Connecticut and Massachusetts. While Dutch influence was felt here in the Adirondacks due to the fur trade, they never really spent any time here. Instead, it was the French, with Samuel de Champlain being the first European to trek through this area. The French, like both the Dutch and the British, were highly invested in the fur trade. French efforts in New York, though, centered further north around Lake Champlain. Despite this, they still came into conflict with their European rivals throughout the 17th century. By the 1670s, the Dutch were pushed out of the New Netherlands, the colony and its fur trade now falling under British rule. Renamed New York, the colony began to grow beyond its trade routes, with settlements appearing up the Hudson Valley. Both the Catskills and the Adirondacks heavily influenced how New York was colonized. Those rugged peaks channeled colonization efforts towards the rivers and the lakes, areas where there was tillable land and an easy way to move both goods and people. The New York colony thrived, growing to be one of the wealthiest of the 13 colonies. But its focus was always centered around New York City. The Adirondacks, on the other hand, remained a mystery, a vast, imposing, inhospitable wilderness. Perhaps best reflected by a colonial map of New York published in 1771, where the northeastern corner of the colony is basically left as a blank space. Here be dragons, and all that. In the first half of the 18th century, tensions continued to ratchet up between the British and the French. Multiple conflicts flared up between the two powers around the globe, with their proxies duking it out in the colonies. Both sides built forts and defenses to maintain control of the region and protect the ever-vital trade routes. In 1755, though, things exploded on a much larger scale. While the French and Indian War may have started in the backwoods of Pennsylvania, some of the heaviest fighting actually took place up here in the Adirondacks in New York. It didn't occur in the mountains, though. Those were too difficult to get men and supplies through. Instead, the fighting occurred in the river valleys that cut through them. The Adirondack and Catskill Mountains to the west, and the Green Mountains and Taconics to the east, effectively served as walls. That meant it was imperative to control Lake Champlain and the Hudson River Valley in order to move troops north and south. These geological features dictated how the war took shape in New York. While there were multiple battles fought in this theater, there were two in particular that are worth noting. The first being the siege of Fort William Henry and the second being the Battle of Fort Carillon. Of those two, the Siege of Fort William Henry is perhaps the better known. In August of 1757, French and native forces laid siege to that fort, which was located at the south end of Lake George. After several days of bombardment, the outnumbered British forces chose to surrender. The terms of the surrender allowed for British forces under French escort to withdraw to Fort Edward, 16 miles south of Fort William Henry. These terms, though, were quickly violated, as native forces assaulted the British column, killing, wounding, and capturing men, women, and children. It became one of the most notorious events of the war, and was later immortalized in James Fenimore Cooper's book, The Last of the Mohicans. The other battle of note was at Fort Carillon. The fort was built in 1755 by the French to protect the southern end of Lake Champlain against British incursion. It was a highly defensible position, surrounded by water on three sides, and any chance to control the region as a whole meant you had to take the fort. The British had assembled a force of 16,000 men, the largest deployed in North America during the war. Their intent was to overwhelm the much smaller garrison at Fort Carillon. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the French garrison put up a fierce resistance and repelled the British attack. It was a bloody affair with over 3,000 casualties, making it the bloodiest battle of the French and Indian War. Despite victory, French defeats elsewhere forced them to abandon the fort in 1759. The British seized it and renamed it Fort Ticonderoga. And while it wouldn't play a role for the remainder of this war, it was significant during the next. When the war finally ended in 1763, Great Britain found itself with substantially more territory in North America. As for the colony of New York, this area started to see increased settlement, mainly by veterans of the war. Many of those parties chose to settle around Lake George and Lake Champlain. The strategic importance of this area came to the forefront again during the American Revolution just 2 decades later. The first was the capture of Fort Ticonderoga in 1775 by Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen. The cannons that were seized made a long trip to Boston, where their emplacement on Dorchester Heights helped drive the British from the city. While this region was sparsely populated, it was bitterly divided in loyalty. The New York colony in general was something of a crown stronghold, with more loyalists living in this colony than any other. New York City itself would spend a majority of the American Revolution under the control of British forces. In the countryside, things were a little different. It was often subject to ransacking and raiding by both Patriot and Loyalist forces. The strategic importance of the area was still a crucial factor, and Great Britain planned a campaign to isolate New England from the others. Like the French and Indian War, the key to success relied on establishing control over Lake Champlain and the Hudson River Valley. In 1777, the British launched a complex three-pronged assault on the region, with forces coming from New York City in the south, the Mohawk Valley to the west, and down from Canada in the north. Their goal was to link up in Albany and effectively split the colonies. The invasion from the north initially started off successful, but it slowly ground to a halt. Lord William Howe, commander of the southern forces, opted to take his army and make a move instead against Pennsylvania. British forces coming from the west got tied up at Fort Stanwix, and this left General Burgoyne alone to continue on with the plan. By September, the overall strategy was in shambles. The last remaining prong, the one from the north, had made a difficult march and had arrived at the village of Saratoga. Here, General John Burgoyne faced an entrenched American army under the command of General Horatio Gates. On September 19th, Burgoyne launched an attack to flank the Patriots at Freeman's Farm. After intense fighting throughout the day, the Americans were forced to fall back to their defensive works. While Burgoyne, in effect, had won the fight here at Freeman's Farm, he found himself in a predicament. He had taken casualties that he couldn't afford, and the Americans, they hadn't actually withdrawn. They'd just moved back to their own defensive positions. And to make matter worse, their number was growing, with new Patriot forces arriving daily. Burgoyne soon found out that any chance for reinforcement for him was not going to happen. So by October, with food supplies dwindling, things were looking pretty dire for the British. Despite being advised to retreat, Burgoyne refused, and on October 7th, ordered a reconnaissance in force on the American positions at Bemis Heights. The Americans repelled it, and under the leadership of Benedict Arnold, assaulted the British fortifications. By nightfall, the British found themselves flanked and retreated. 10 days later, surrounded by American forces, General John Burgoyne surrendered. The battles fought at Saratoga would be a turning point in the American Revolution and some of the most critical ever fought in American history. A victory over a superior British force came at a time when Patriot morale desperately needed a boost. But more importantly than that, the victory here helped America secure the alliances with foreign powers like the French, Dutch, and Spanish that it needed to be able to win the war. The Adirondacks saw conflict one last time in the War of 1812 with the Battle of Plattsburgh. The American victory successfully thwarted a British invasion to take control of Lake Champlain and gave the American diplomats negotiating terms to end the war a stronger position. If you were to ask an early New Yorker where the tallest mountain was in their colony or early state, it's most likely they would point you to the Catskills. With their close proximity to New York City, these mountains were captivating. The Catskill Mountains are easily the most well-known range in the state and have greatly influenced American culture, being a popular spot for artists of the Hudson River School, and later being one of the birthplaces of modern stand-up comedy. The highest peak in the range is Slide Mountain, with an elevation of at least 4,180 feet, though its actual height has never been officially determined. In the years after the Revolutionary War, the state of New York looked to incentivize settlement up north by offering free land to soldiers to come up here. The Adirondacks' reputation had preceded it, referred to at the time as the Dismal Wilderness. Almost no one took the state up on their offer. The first community to be established on the edge of the wilderness was the town of Plattsburgh in 1785, along the shores of Lake Champlain. In the interior of the Adirondacks, it was another story. It would take another 3 decades before pioneers arrived to homestead it. Part of the reason settlement was so slow here was because, frankly, getting into the interior was difficult. There was nothing in the way of navigable waters, and that meant cutting roads, a time-consuming and expensive proposition. To add on to that, there was no real financial incentive to come here. The first road through the High Peaks Wilderness was initially blazed in 1787, but it wasn't until 1810 when the state legislature appropriated funding to improve the wagon trail into a proper road. It was known as the Northwest Bay Trail and stretched from Westport on the banks of Lake Champlain to Hopkinson, where it would connect with the St. Lawrence River Turnpike. The road was known for its windy, rough nature, and traveling on it was slow and arduous. In one section, it was referred to as a 6-hour, 6-mile road due to the amount of distance you could cover in that time. Despite this, it proved invaluable, and more than a few sections of the road are still in use today, now paved and much smoother than before. That doesn't mean you can't experience some of the old road, because you can. 4.5 miles of it still exists in pretty much its original fashion. And if you want to take a step back in history, well, you can. You can go hike it. It's part of the Jackrabbit Ski Trail. With a more reliable way to access the interior, pioneers slowly started to trickle in. In 1819, Jacob Moody Smith and his family arrived from Keene, New Hampshire, and settled in what is now the village of Saranac Lake. 8 years later, a sawmill and dam were built, and a village started to take shape around it. As people slowly started to journey their way into the Adirondacks, that blank area of uncharted wilderness was now demanding to be filled in. In 1836, Governor William Leonard Marcy ordered the staff of New York's Geological and Natural History Survey to conduct a grand and comprehensive collection of the natural productions of the state of New York. The geological part of that all-encompassing effort here in the Adirondacks fell to Ebenezer Emmons. It was Emmons who determined that the highest point in the state was not in the Catskills as previously thought, but here in the Adirondacks. In fact, he went on to prove that 29 peaks in the Adirondacks were higher than the highest peak in the Catskills. Emmons estimated that the tallest peak among these mountains would easily be over 5,000 feet. When that number was disputed, he reached out to a colleague of his at the University of Vermont, who then proceeded to calculate that the highest peak in the Adirondacks would be 5,334 feet, just 1 foot off of Mount Marcy's modern-day measurement. While it's likely Emmons was not the first person to climb Mount Marcy, he and his party did make the first official recorded summit of it on August 5, 1837, after bushwhacking through dense forests and thick alpine growth. He named the peak in honor of Governor Marcy. Another name floated about was Tawahoose by poet and author Charles Fenimore Huffman, who visited this area in 1837. It was a name that came from the Seneca language, meaning cloud splitter or he splits the sky. It appealed to a lot of New Yorkers who lobbied to make this the official name of the peak, believing it to be the original indigenous name. Interestingly enough, though, there is no evidence that it was prior to Huffman. Names already existed for these mountains. The Abenaki called the range Wawobadanek, meaning White Mountains. The Missisquoi Abenaki called Marcy Waumdeneg, meaning always white, while the Mohawk called the peak Tewawiesta. Along with the mountains, Emmons also proposed the name for the mountain range, Adirondacks. This does come from a native word, an Anglicization of the Mohawk word Ratarantax. It was proposed because it was thought to commemorate a tribe that once lived here. But there's a slight problem with that. Here's where things take a turn for the interesting. It is true that the Mohawks did use the term to describe a tribe. It meant tree eaters, and they used it as an insult. But the tribe they used it to describe had actually nothing to do with the Adirondacks. Instead, their territory was up near the Ottawa River Valley, on the border between Ontario and Quebec. Further economic activities started to crop up in the mid-19th century. One of the more significant ones was the McIntyre Iron Works. Archibald McIntyre came to the area in search of silver, but upon the discovery of iron, quickly began purchasing substantial quantities of land, eventually numbering over 100,000 acres at the company's height. Shortly thereafter, he established the Adirondack Iron and Steel Company, later renamed and expanded. The mine and the ironworks here were never profitable concerns. Getting iron out of this area, whether ore or worked, was cost prohibitive. There was also an odd impurity in the iron coming from here that made it difficult to work. There was clamor for a rail line and make transportation of goods cheaper, but it never came, and eventually the mine was closed. The mine remained dormant for several decades until it was reopened. That impurity that made the iron so difficult to process
was actually a rarer metal, titanium, and at the start of World War II, it was now in high demand. The mine continued to operate until 1982, when it was finally closed. The McIntyre Iron Works wasn't the only mine in the Adirondacks. During the 1800s, there were up to 200 mines in the region. In a testament to just how difficult it was to operate in this rugged landscape, only 2 of them ever turned a profit.
The legacy of the McIntyre Iron Works and mining in general in the Adirondacks is a complicated one. But one thing they did do was spur on conservation efforts to protect the High Peaks Wilderness and the Adirondacks as a whole. The Adirondacks are rich in history and have had a diverse cast of characters, more than a few who have strode across the national stage. One of the most famous in those early days was the abolitionist, John Brown. Brown came to the area in 1848. He built a farm. He himself actually spent little time here. The farm was mainly for his family, to serve as a place of refuge.
Brown was a fierce abolitionist and a proponent of violent emancipation for black slaves. He came to national prominence during the Bleeding Kansas crisis in the 1850s. In 1859, Brown led a raid on Harper's Ferry to secure arms for a slave revolt. The raid failed. Brown was captured, tried, and executed for treason against the state of Virginia. Afterwards, his wife, Mary Ann, brought his body back to North Elba, where Brown was buried.
As for the farm itself today, it's a National Historic Landmark and a New York State Historical Site. It's worth visiting if you want to understand a bit more one of the key issues plaguing the country during the first half of the 1800s. It's also worth checking out if you want to know a little bit more on what it was like to live in this area in those times as well.
In the latter half of the 19th century, the Adirondacks became a popular tourist destination with droves of people trekking through the mountains. A book published by William H. Murray in 1869 titled Adventures in the Wilderness, or Camp Life in the Adirondacks, sparked the imagination of thousands of readers, who then flocked to the area to experience the mountains for themselves.
The Adirondacks were a perfect place to escape the hustle and bustle of 19th century Industrial Revolution life. Mount Marcy would prove to be one of the highlights of the area, the lure of climbing to the top of New York proving to be irresistible. And over the next several decades, hundreds of people would make the long trek to its summit.
Other luminaries that enjoyed these peaks included the author Robert Louis Stevenson and Ralph Waldo Emerson. In the summer of 1858, 10 scholars, including Emerson, arrived from the Boston area. They came to the Adirondacks and camped at Folensby Pond in what became known as the Philosopher's Camp. Of the many people who did make the journey, one of the most noteworthy was a 40-year-old man named Theodore Roosevelt, at the time the Vice President of the United States. Roosevelt was a big fan of the mountains, appreciating their beauty and isolation, visiting the area several times throughout his life. This time, though, was different. Just days earlier, on September 6, 1901, President William McKinley was shot by Leon Czolgosz in Buffalo, New York. Initial progress was positive, and the president was expected to make a full recovery.
On September 12th, Theodore Roosevelt and his family stepped off to do a 21-mile out-and-back bushwhack to the summit of Mount Marcy. While eating lunch at Lake Tear the Clouds, he was informed that McKinley's condition was rapidly deteriorating. To make matters worse, the weather was also turning sour. Roosevelt knew, though, he had to get to Buffalo as soon as possible. So undaunted, he made his way down the mountain, but by the time he reached North Creek train station, he was informed that McKinley had died. Roosevelt became President of the United States on his journey out of the Adirondacks.
Roosevelt was sworn in as the 26th President of the United States, at the Wilcox Mansion in Buffalo on September 15th. These days, you can retrace Roosevelt's midnight ride by following the Roosevelt-Marcy Trail, 40-mile route starting at Long Lake and finishing in North Creek. He wasn't the only president to spend time in these mountains. Calvin Coolidge summered here at White Pine Camp in 1926.
By the late 1800s, all those hikers from past decades had taken a toll on the mountain. Compounded by the effects of the timber and mining industries, the Adirondacks were suffering from deforestation and erosion. There was a groundswell of support to protect this area. And one of the leading figures of that movement was a man named Verplanck Colvin.
In 1872, at the age of 25, Verplanck Colvin was appointed superintendent of the Adirondack Survey, a position he would hold for the next 28 years. One of Colvin's greatest talents was his use of triangulation, which he used to produce incredibly accurate maps. During his time as superintendent, Colvin discovered Lake Tier of the Clouds, charted the headwaters of the Hudson River on the slopes of Mount Marcy, and by 1880, produced the most thorough survey of the Adirondacks up to that time.
Along with his talent as a surveyor, Colvin was also a staunch advocate for preserving the wildness of the mountains. It's safe to say he fell in love with this area, and that translated into a lifelong pursuit to keep the Adirondacks pristine.
As Colvin himself wrote, quote, "The Adirondack Wilderness may be considered the wonder and glory of New York. It is a vast natural park, one immense and silent forest, curiously and beautifully broken by the gleaming waters of a myriad of lakes, between which rugged mountain ranges rise as a sea of granite billows." Unquote.
Colvin's relentless advocacy had the desired results. In 1892, the Adirondack Park was created, and in 1894, the state of New York constitutionally designated it as Forever Wild. At 6 million acres, it is the largest park in the contiguous United States. It's a different type of entity than we're mainly familiar with. It's not a national park, nor, despite the state of New York owning 2.6 million acres of it, is it a state park.
Colvin wasn't the only individual to fall head over heels in love with these peaks. Another was Henry Van Hoevenberg, born in Oswego, New York in 1849. An electrical engineer by trade, it was his seasonal allergies that brought Van Hoevenberg to the Adirondacks, the mountains providing a welcome respite from his hay fever.
Van Hoevenberg first came to the Adirondacks in 1877. There, he met Miss Josephine Schofield, and the two fell deeply in love. They were also smitten with the mountains. As the story goes, they climbed to the top of Mount Marcy, and from the summit, looked out and chose the most beautiful spot they could see for their future home. That spot, Heart Lake, became the site in 1879 for the first Adirondack Lodge. In a tragic turn of events, though, Josephine Schofield never got a chance to see it. She died the year prior.
The original lodge opened in 1880. It was a larger building than the one we see today, with 3 stories, 60 rooms, and even a 70-foot observation tower. You could stay there for $4 a night, or $16 a week, and that included meals. It quickly became a draw for people due to its proximity to Mount Marcy, providing an easier gateway for High Peaks wilderness adventure.
The lodge wasn't Van Hoevenberg's only contribution, though. The man was a trailblazer as well, cutting trails into the High Peaks wilderness. Prior to his efforts, if you wanted to go somewhere in that area, you needed an experienced woodsman or guide to lead you along a path of axe marks if you were lucky. Van Hoevenberg changed that. With his efforts, he made wide, clear trails that the average person could enjoy, and they became the foundation for the trail system we know and love today.
When it came to the trails Van Hoevenberg laid in, he didn't just cut the shortest distance between 2 points. His intent was for hikers to take in the beauty of the Adirondacks, with trails winding through the stunning scenery. By the late 1880s, Van Hoevenberg had cut 50 miles worth of trails, including routes for Mounts Marcy, Algonquin, and Joe. Despite his efforts and the popularity of the mountains, the lodge proved costly to maintain, and Van Hoevenberg was plagued with financial issues. He sold the property in 1898 to the Lake Placid Company, but continued on as its caretaker for several years.
The lodge would be destroyed by fire in 1903, and Van Hoevenberg himself passed away in 1918. He's still remembered here in the Adirondacks with both a mountain and the trail leading to Mount Marcy bearing his name.
As the 20th century marched along, the Adirondacks continued to draw in people across the world. They served as the backdrop to 2 Winter Olympiads, the first in 1932 and later in 1980. These days, the Adirondack Mountains continue to be a popular destination for those with an adventurous spirit. Getting to the top of Mount Marcy is going to require a bit of work. You're going to want to be prepared for this hike. It's a 7-mile trek to the summit, 14 miles out and back. You start near the Adirondack Lodge. Make sure to sign the register before you step off.
For this hike, I had a 3.5 liter bladder and an Nalgene bottle filled with electrolytes. Plus I had my trekking poles, a good pair of boots, my floppy hat, and a long sleeve and a short sleeve shirt, both which came in very handy. I also had bug repellent and sunscreen. So this is definitely a hike that is long enough where you're going to want to be prepared, and that all is going to come down to what your preferences are. But remember, if you're carrying it in, you got to carry it up there and carry it back. The trail from the lodge to Mount Marcy Dam is straightforward and very easy to follow and very mild. A couple ups and downs, no real big obstacles. Word to the wise though, enjoy it, because this is by far the easiest part of this journey. The first big landmark that you're going to hit on your hike to Mount Marcy is the Marcy Dam. Now, it was washed out in 2011, so they put in a bridge a little bit down from it. While the dam is no longer in service, it is a great place to take a break and have a picnic. If you want a little history of the dam, it was originally built in the 1930s during the Great Depression by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Once you get past the Indian Falls junction, the trail sort of levels out. You're still going up, you're still grinding, but it is definitely not as aggressive as what you just went through. Hopefully you enjoyed your brief respite, because it won't be long before you are grinding back up again. After that intersection, as you head up to the ridge, you'll be spending a lot of time hiking on this exposed rock. And as you can see, there's water coming down it. Surprisingly, it is not as slick as I thought it would be. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't take a little bit of caution. Once you get to this little open glade, you can actually see Mount Marcy over my shoulder. It's about a mile away, but it's a mountain mile. So prepare yourselves. As you make the push up to the ridge before the final turn to head up to Mount Marcy, brace yourself, because you're going to be gaining a lot of vertical real quick. As you make your final approach up Mount Marcy, there are going to be a few areas where you may have to do a little bit of scrambling, but it's nothing really serious at all. It's rather straightforward. And here we are on the summit of Mount Marcy, the rooftop of New York, with an elevation of 5,343 feet. This is the 21st highest state high point in the USA. I'm Scott Marthaler. Thanks for joining me on Rooftops of America. Before you go, leave a comment, click those like and subscribe buttons below, and I'll see you soon.